So this will be a screencast to take the place of in-person class meeting on April 8th, 2024 in Biology 1134. So last Friday we ended class talking about the plant life cycle, and just so you get an exposure to this again, I want to go back through it again. This figure is essentially divided into two halves. There's a diploid half in the lower half and a haploid half of the life cycle of plants in the upper half. And I always like to start with fertilization because that's familiar to us. You have an egg and a sperm. Those two go through fertilization to produce a diploid zygote. This diploid zygote is then going to go through mitosis to create a multicellular embryo, and ultimately that embryo is going to be maybe packaged in a seed or something like that. And when that seed germinates, it will grow into a diploid sporophyte. The sporophyte, because it's diploid, has the ability to go through meiosis, but it's going to do this by forming a sporangium. In many cases, this is a specialized morphological structure that contains spore mother cells. These spore mother cells can be different sizes depending on whether it's a spore mother cell that's going to produce a male gametophyte or a female gametophyte, which will be a larger spore mother cell. But these spore mother cells go through the process of meiosis, and after they have gone through meiosis, they have created haploid spores. You need to keep in mind that these haploid spores are not gametes. Gametes are over here. These spores are actually cells that are going to grow into the haploid gametophyte. The gametophyte is the phase of the plant life cycle that gives rise through mitosis to sperm and egg, which will then be used to create a new diploid zygote. So think of this as two different plants. That's why it is called the alternation of generations. One generation of the plant is a sporophyte, it's a diploid. It produces spores that then grow up the haploid generation of the life cycle, which is the gametophyte. So after fertilization, this is all mitosis to create the sporophyte and the spore mother cell. Then we have meiosis, but then these spores, these haploid spores, go through mitosis to grow the gametophyte, and then the gametophyte goes through mitosis to form egg and sperm, and then you get fertilization. Now, in some groups, the sporophyte is the dominant generation. It's the thing that looks most like a plant. In other groups, it is the gametophyte that grows up and looks most like the plant. And it just depends on which particular division of plants you're looking at as to whether the sporophyte is the dominant generation or the gametophyte is the dominant generation. So as we go through the different groups of plants, we're going to revisit this life cycle and see how it plays out in each of them. This is just a diagram from your book, or a series of diagrams from your book showing the generalized alternation of generations and showing you how in bryophytes, for example, the gametophyte is the thing that looks like the plant. The sporophyte is the diploid portion that looks less like a plant and more like a flowering stalk or something like this. In the case of ferns, the gametophyte is really, really tiny. And on the gametophyte, there will be Archegonia and Antheridia. The Archegonia produce the eggs, the Antheridia produce the sperm, and the sperm will fertilize the egg right here on the gametophyte, and after that happens, the fern sporophyte will grow up out of that. On the underside of the fern leaves, you saw in lab, there are sori. These sori contain sporangia. Those sporangia produce haploid spores, which are then released and then go on to form the gametophyte that then produces Archegonia and Antheridia that then allow for fertilization to produce a new sporophyte. We also talked to you in lab about the life cycle of both pines and angiosperms, and once again, in these cases, the sporophyte is the dominant structure, the dominant organism that produces very, very tiny gametophytes. In the case of flowering plants, the gametophytes are no more than 8 cells big. And so we'll look at that in more detail when we get to the section on flowering plants. So We can think of plants as a set of terrestrial plants that have evolved from aquatic algae. And these aquatic algae basically didn't need a lot of the adaptations of land plants because they were in water. We already talked about the differences between the terrestrial environment and the aquatic environment. But what you see is in these bryophytes, liverworts, mosses, and hornworts, these are all organisms that have fewer adaptations to terrestrial life. As a result, they tend to live in moist areas, in cool areas, places where water stress really isn't much of a problem. And as you move to more and more recently evolved groups of plants, you will see them acquiring adaptations that allow them to cope with the hotter, drier, less supportive environments of terrestrial environments. And this kind of reaches its apex in the seed-bearing plants and that are the Gymnosperms and the Angiosperms. So here are some of the synapomorphies that have led to plants being able to come out and colonize onto land. We have the development of the cuticle, we have the development of specialized reproductive structures, then we have the development of stomata that once again allow air to enter the leaves while also reducing water loss, hopefully. We have the development of vascular tissues that allow plants to move materials around the plant body. That comes with it the ability to grow true stems, roots, and leaves. We have euphylls that have branching vascular tissues as opposed to lycophylls and the lycophytes that have unbranched vascular tissues. And then we have the development of seeds, which allow the embryo to be better protected and provisioned in the terrestrial environment. And then we have the evolution of fruits and flowers in the angiosperms. Once again, these are all advantages that take advantage of the animals that live in terrestrial environments that can help both pollinate, move gametes around, but also move the embryos around in the form of seeds. So this is the arc of the evolution that we're going to be looking at. We're going to look in more detail at each of these different major groups of plants. So when we think of the term bryophytes, that is a general term, but it's a general term that refers to three separate divisions of plants. Remember that division is the plant equivalent of phylum in animals. And so the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts are all different divisions within this general category that we refer to as the bryophytes. All of these groups lack vascular tissues. They lack roots because roots, part of the definition of what a root is that it has vascular tissues. The gametophyte is the dominant generation. It's large and it is photosynthetic. Generally speaking, the sporophyte is small and dependent upon the gametophyte for energy, although in hornworts, the sporophyte is actually also photosynthetic as well. These guys require water for sexual reproduction because their sperm basically are little swimmers. These are relatively small in stature because they lack vascular tissues, and the lack of vascular tissues places an upper limit on the size that a plant can achieve because it can't move water and nutrients around the plant body very well. It doesn't have roots, but it does have rhizoids, and these rhizoids anchor the plants, and they also absorb water and nutrients, but once again, they can't transport this water and nutrients over very large distances in the plant body because of the lack of vascular tissues. And decent diversity, 24,700 species in the groups as a whole. So we have liverworts, which are in the division Mercantiophyta. These have flattened gametophytes that look like little lobes, and they will put up these little stalks that look like umbrellas that basically are the gametangia. And the gametangia are where the gametophyte is actually going through mitosis to produce egg and sperm in order to go through sexual reproduction. Mosses are in the division Bryophyta. The gametophytes are these leaf-like structures down here at the bottom of this image, leaf-like structures around the central axis. They don't have true leaves because there is no vascular tissue. Once again, they don't have true roots because they have no vascular tissue, but they do have stomata, which is a major evolutionary innovation. This multicellular gametangium forms at the tip of the gametophyte, and there are male gametangia and female gametangia, and there are actually male and female gametophytes. When the male gametophyte fertilizes the female gametophyte has the ovum in it. That then creates a diploid embryo, and the diploid embryo grows up out of the top of the gametangium. It puts up this stalk that is the sporophyte. The sporangium is at the tip of it. This is where meiosis is going to occur to produce spores. Those spores will leave the sporophyte and then germinate into a new gametophyte. They have archegonia and antheridia, so they have female and male gametangia, and this is what their life cycle looks like. We have fertilization when the antheridia produce sperm. Sperm fertilize the eggs. At that point, you have the development of a zygote, but this zygote is in the top of this gametophyte. That then develops into an embryo, and that embryo develops into a sporophyte. That sporophyte then goes through meiosis to produce spores. These spores then germinate. Some of them become male gametophytes, others become female gametophytes. At the tip of both the male and the female gametophyte, you have the development of antheridia if you're at the top of the male gametophyte, archegonia if you're at the top of the female gametophyte. You produce sperm and egg, fertilization occurs, and you repeat the cycle once again. And then with hornworts, their origin is a little more obscure than the other groups because there aren't very many early fossils. In this case, the sporophyte is photosynthetic, which is not the case with either the true mosses or the liverworts. And once again, you see that the sporophyte is embedded in the gametophyte tissue. And these are distinctive from other plants in that the cells have a single large chloroplast rather than lots of small chloroplasts. So once you get past the bryophytes are basically the non-vascular plants. They're plants that lack vascular tissues. And from here on out, the Lycophytes all the way to the Angiosperms, these are more recently evolved groups of plants. And one of the evolutionary innovations that they all possess is they all possess the presence of vascular tissues. So we have the vascular plants versus the non-vascular plants, and the vascular plants include the Lycophytes as well as the ferns and fern allies and the seed-bearing plants, the Gymnosperms, which bear cones, and the Angiosperms, which bear flowers. Vascularization allowed for the transport of materials up and down the body of the plant, allows for better support because you have the development of a vascular cambium. Based on fossil evidence, stems evolved before roots did, and evidently leaves have evolved multiple times, and we have two different types of leaf structure, lycophils and euphils, and we'll get to how those differ from one another in a few minutes. There was a long period of time between the appearance of vascular tissues and the appearance of euphils, evidently, and so sometimes evolution goes in fits and starts. But this was all probably driven by drops in levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide in the distant geological past when plants needed to get better access to carbon dioxide. So when we think about leaf evolution, we basically can look at the structure of lycophils, and we can see a stem with vascular tissue and then a stem with leaf-like tissue that is growing out from that stem, and then that vascular tissue branches off and enters the leafy tissue and adds it to the adds vascular tissue to that leaf. But once it's in the leaf, that vascular tissue doesn't branch. In the origin of euphylls, what you have is you have branching stems with vascular tissue in them, but then these branching stems produce leaf-like material, but those leaf-like material basically has webs or branches of the vascular tissue within them until you get what modern leaves look like. The importance of this, the importance of euphylls and this netted venation in plants, or even the parallel venation that has little tiny connections between it, is really illustrated well in a video that I've placed on the Canvas site. So there's a video on the Canvas site in this plant material. I think it's in Monday's material, actually April 8th. There's a video that has some visualizations that some botanists made that shows how plants can move substances around leaf damage as a result of this branching pattern of venation that euphylls affords plants. It's informative in helping you understand that when plants emerged and came out onto land, they were subject to a different set of predators that would feed on them, a different set of herbivores, and these herbivores would eat the leaves, and netted venation, among other things, gives them the ability to move materials around the leaves in a way that you couldn't do if you only had lycophylls. So go and look at that video, and I think you'll find it both entertaining and informative. So vascular plants have xylem and phloem. Remember that xylem carries materials from the roots up to the above ground portions of the plants, the shoots, carries water, carries minerals, nutrients, stored energy. All of that is going from being stored down in the roots or acquired by the roots and then moved to the above ground portions of the plant. Phloem takes the products of photosynthesis and translocates them from the shoots down into the roots. And this is not only the products of photosynthesis, but it also moves other chemicals around the plant. For example, we'll talk about auxins later in this unit on plants. And those are hormones that are also moved around the plant body. So when we think about lycophytes, they resemble mosses in a lot of ways, but in this case, the green leafy looking thing is the sporophyte. Once again, they have lycophylls, which are these leaf-like structures, but there's just a single strand of vascular tissue. There's no branching. Hopefully you looked at the example of Selaginella that we had in lab last week, and you could flip that over, and on the underside of those leaves, you could see that the vascular tissue, the venation of those, it looks like there's just a single finger of vascular tissue going into each of those lycophylls. This is not a particularly speciose group, but it's a group that is common in horticulture. For example, Selaginella is a common house plant. These are also sometimes referred to as club mosses, and this plant here on the right gives you an example of another type of growth form, and is actually the type of growth form that you would normally think of as being where the term club moss came from. Once again, all these little leaf-like structures are just going to have one little finger of vascular tissue going into them. Ferns and fern allies include the true ferns, the whisk ferns, and the horsetail ferns. And so you have all three represented here. This is a tree fern, this is a whisk fern, and this is a horsetail fern. Horsetails you could find horsetail ferns here in Oklahoma. I have some growing in the creek, near the creek, on the land that I bought here in the Norman area. And once again, ferns are also common house plants. They all have antheridia and archegonia. They still require water for flagellated sperm, so we haven't gotten away from that reliance upon water for the distribution of gametes. Ferns and fern allies are all in the division Polypodiophyta, but each of these occurs in their own subdivision. So ferns have leaves. The leaves are called fronds, and on the underside of the frond is where you will find the sori. These sori are the sporangia, so this is where the sporophyte is going through meiosis and producing spores. So these are not seeded plants. These are going to produce spores. Those spores will germinate and they will develop right into a a new gametophyte, and then that gametophyte will produce a new embryo through fertilization. Decent diversity, but a big chunk of that diversity is found mainly in the tropics, although we do have plenty of temperate ferns as well. Sporophytes are large, once again, sporophyte dominant group, and the gametophytes are small, and I've spelled gametophyte incorrectly there. And in this case, both the sporophyte and the gametophyte are photosynthetic. This is the life cycle of a fern, and like I mentioned before, you have specialized archegonia and antheridia that are on the gametophyte. They produce sperm and egg on the gametophyte at fertilization. That then produces a zygote. That zygote develops into an embryo, and that embryo begins to grow a small sporophyte, and that sporophyte eventually will grow into a mature fern. But this gametophyte is a little tiny leaf down at the base of that fern frond that is coming up. This shows ferns growing off of rhizomes, which are these horizontal roots, and it can reproduce vegetatively as well as through sexual reproduction. On the underside of the frond, you will find a sporangia. In the sporangia, you will find, in the sori, on the underside are sori. In the sorus, you will find sporangia, and the sporangium is what creates the spores. The spores are not differentiated into male and female spores. They just give rise to a generalized gametophyte, once again, which is very small. And then that gametophyte is capable of producing both a male antheridium and a female archegonium. The antheridium produces sperm, the archegonium produces egg, and you start the whole thing over again. After we are finished with the ferns, we get to the seed plants, and these are the two dominant groups of plants that we have on land. And seed plants are of two major types: those that reproduce with cones and those that reproduce with flowers. These have been around for a couple 100 million years, but the evolution of the seed was a major evolutionary development because it protects the embryo. It provides food for the embryo. It allows for periods of dormancy during harsh environmental conditions, and it allows plants to encase their embryos in fruits, which ultimately facilitate dispersal. So all seed plants produce two types of spores that produce two types of gametophytes. The male gametophyte is called the microspore, and it produces pollen, and the female gametophyte produces the ovum, and we can see that in the pine life cycle, which should be the next slide. And not the next slide, but we're over here in the seed plant area, so we've romped through all of this evolution up to this point. So in the pine life cycle, fertilization once again occurs here, where you have pollen that comes into contact with an ovum, and that ovum is fertilized to produce a zygote. That zygote grows into an embryo, and that embryo is found inside the pine seed. And so these pine seeds then are going to germinate and grow into a seedling, and that will eventually grow into the tree, and that is the adult form of the sporophyte. In pines will create both a pollen-bearing cone and an ovum-bearing cone. And so we have two different cone types. The pollen-bearing cones are generally smaller than the ovum-bearing cones, but the pollen-bearing cones will create pollen ultimately. But inside the scales of the cone are microspore mother cells. So all of these are a bunch of microspore mother cells. Those microspore mother cells go through meiosis to create microspores, and these microspores ultimately develop into a pollen grain. Inside of that pollen grain, there will be, once again, a tube cell nucleus, and there will be a generative nucleus. That generative nucleus produces two sperm. the tube cell nucleus produces the pollen tube that the sperm travel down so that they can fertilize the ovum that is coming from the megaspore mother cell, which is coming from the female cone. This megaspore mother cell develops into 4 haploid megaspores. All of those die off except one. That one goes through mitosis to produce all of the cells that are in the gametophyte generation, and all of that is going on inside of this scale. And so once again, relative to the size of the sporophyte, the gametophyte generation is really, really tiny. And then the sperm from the pollen fertilize the ovum, and you once again have the development of a zygote into an embryo, and the process begins all over again. Yeah, I think I've been through all of that. So when we think about the gymnosperms, the cone-bearing seed plants, those are generally going to be things that you're familiar with in many cases. The pines and the pinophyta, the cycads, which is a common horticultural plant in the cycadophyta. The ones that you're not going, cycads, which are commonly used in horticulture, but I pointed to a ginkgo. This is the sago palm, which is a common horticultural plant. It's in the cycads. Cycads have been around. In many ways, they look very similar to fossil cycads. The neophytes you don't know as much about because you probably haven't seen them because it's a reduced number of species. They occur in Africa, but they're interesting because they have a very interesting life cycle. And then you are probably familiar with ginkgos in the Ginkgophyta because, once again, that's a common horticultural plant. And then we get to angiosperms. Angiosperms are the flowering plants. They are in the division Magnoliophyta. It's the most diverse group of plants. They're the plants that came out onto land and kind of conquered the terrestrial environment. And the reason that they were able to do this is that they possess a unique set of characteristics that allow for this diversification and allow them to be successful on land. And these characteristics are the development of flowers, the reduction of the size of the gametophyte, the development of carpels and the fruits that are associated with carpels, the development of endosperm, and the development of more complex vasculature. And so when we think about flowers is where the gametophytes are found. It improved the efficiency of pollination, and this allows for increased genetic diversity because it's easier to move pollen around from one plant to another. Remember that pollen is the male gamete. The size of the gametophytes is really reduced. We'll see in the angiosperm life cycle that the life cycle of the plant has a gametophyte that is only, in the case of the female, only 8 cells big. And we'll see how that happens here in a little while. So because there's a reduced gametophyte, you can produce seeds faster. You don't devote as many resources to growing up that gametophyte. And so the gametophyte is really tiny, which means you can produce it quickly, which means you can produce seeds quickly, and you're not dumping a lot of energy into that. Carpels and the fruits that protect the ovule provide the ovule protection, and also the fruits provide mechanisms of dispersal. The endosperm, we'll see where that comes from, provides nutrition for the developing embryo, and then once again, just the more complicated vasculature essentially allows more efficient water transportation around the plant body than the vascular tissues that we saw in gymnosperms, for example. So when we think about flowering plants, they have a flower structure, and you guys ripped apart flowers in lab, and you should have seen most of these things. But the gametophyte, the female gametophyte, is just down here at the base of the carpel. So this whole thing is the carpel. The carpel has a stigma at the top, a style, which is this stalk here, and then it has an ovary, and inside the ovary is the ovule, and it's that ovule that is actually where the gametophyte, the female gametophyte, resides. The male gametophyte is housed inside the anther, and the anther is part of a stamen, and so you have a filament that basically elevates the stamen up in the structure of the flower, and inside of the anther is where you have microspores forming, and this is where meiosis is going to be occurring to produce the haploid sperm, which will ultimately grow into a pollen grain. So the megaspore mother cell is down in here, the microspore mother cell is up here, the megaspore mother cell eventually ends up producing an ovum as well as some other cells, which we'll see in a minute, and the microspore mother cells ultimately produce pollen. So what does this look like? At fertilization, the fertilization in angiosperms goes through a double fertilization. Both the ovum gets fertilized and this middle cell right here also gets fertilized. And so this middle cell will ultimately grow into the endosperm, and the ovum, once it's fertilized, will ultimately grow into a zygote and then an embryo and ultimately into a plant. That plant is the sporophyte. It's a sporophyte dominant group of plants, and that plant will ultimately produce flowers, and this is a flower that has both male parts and female parts. Inside the anther, you have the development of microspores, and inside the ovule, you have the development of a megaspore. These are all diploid. The anthers, the microspores inside the anthers, will then go through meiosis, and after they go through meiosis, you now have a bunch of haploid spores. Those things then develop into pollen grains. Once again, these cells will have, or these pollen grains will have, a generative cell that creates two sperm cells and a tube cell nucleus, which basically provides a mechanism for creating a pollen tube. And the reason for that is the pollen tube is what allows the sperm to travel from the stigma down through the style, down here to the opening at the base of the ovule that will then allow the sperm access to the ovum and the polar nuclei. So what happens in a megaspore mother cell is it goes through meiosis, and it produces 4 haploid cells, but 3 of those haploid cells degenerate, leaving you with only 1 megaspore. That megaspore then goes through 3 stages of mitosis, and at the end of 3 stages of mitosis, you have 8 cells. 3 of these cells are antipodals or antipodals, depending on how you want to pronounce them. These 3 cells at the top of the ovule. You have a big cell here in the middle with 2 haploid nuclei in it. Those are called the polar nuclei. Then you have the egg, and then right next to the egg, on either side of the egg, are 2 cells called synergids. These are all haploid cells. When the pollen lands on the stigma, the tube cell nucleus will basically burrow a tube all the way down to this opening at the base, the micropyle, and then the 2 sperm will follow after it. And when the 2 sperm get here, 1 sperm is going to fertilize this cell that has the 2 polar nuclei, and that will produce a triploid cell. That triploid cell will go through mitosis and ultimately grow into the cells that make the endosperm. The endosperm is what provides nutrients and energy to the developing embryo. The other sperm cell will actually fertilize the ovum. That fertilized ovum is the zygote. That zygote grows into an embryo. That embryo ultimately will germinate and grow into a mature sporophyte. So there's a lot going on in flowering plant alternation of generations, but this is basically the gist of it. What happens with the formation of the gametophyte, especially in the female gametophyte of flowering plants, is complicated, And my suggestion to you is that you study this by actually drawing out the process, showing the actual cell divisions. And as always, if you need help understanding that, you can feel free to drop by my office and I'll clarify that. I'm going to stop there because I don't want to put too much into what would have normally been a 50-minute class, and I think I'm at about 35 minutes or something like that here, and we'll stop there. And this will be the end of Exam 3 material. We will finish plants next week after we have taken Exam 3. So on Wednesday, we're going to be doing exam review, and Friday is the exam. So I will see you all Wednesday, and I hope you have a good weekend, and I'll see you then.